Hello, everyone. Siobhan here. It is week 45, and this week's training is about why practice matters. And when I say practice, what I'm referring to is specifically practicing the process and what's required for us to stay in the ocean or orienting ourselves in the world through the lens of the soul's consciousness, which is non-dual in its orientation, and any of the accompanying practices that we might actually do in order to support that process. So accompanying practices might be a daily meditation practice, it might be your yoga practice, it might be a creativity practice. Specifically with regards to this work, obviously sort of the priority is practice as defined by consistently listening to the teachings, reflecting on them, contemplating how those teachings are presenting themselves in your day-to-day life, and then engaging in conversation with others in the community or others in your life as a means for you to integrate the teachings into your life and to start to establish the neural pathways that are necessary in order for your consciousness to shift from ego orientation of duality into soul orientation of non-dual awareness. So I want to backpedal, first of all. Anytime we're talking about practice, one of the things that often comes up is discipline and rebellion. And the reason for that is that most of us, when it feels like practice, I don't know very many people who are super consistent with practice, and the people that I do know are people who others look at and they're just like, oh my God, they're crazy disciplined. I'm just not like that. And so we sort of compare ourselves to other people in their commitment to their practice, and then we judge ourselves and then sort of use that judgment as a justification to not do the practice. Oh yeah, I just can't do that. I'm not that disciplined. And then we start to fall into kind of relying on this rebellious nature that doesn't even want to be disciplined. So I think it's important to just put that out there right at the get-go, because a lot of you are going to get triggered just talking about practice. You're immediately going to be like, yeah, fuck that. I don't want to do it. I don't have time or whatever. I'm so busy. I don't have time to listen to the teachings, let alone sit down and meditate or whatever. Or maybe you're like, I've got enough going on already. I don't need to be doing these practices in addition to whatever your current practice might be. So just to begin with, just notice what your response is to practice, because we all tend to have a pretty habitual response to practice. For some of us, we've had an established pattern of practice. Like if you were a musician, you have a very different relationship to practice than somebody who has never trained towards anything. If you're a musician or an athlete, it's like you're just used to practicing. It's just part of your lifestyle, right? It's built into your day-to-day routines. You don't have to think about making time for it. It's actually a part of who you are, and it helps you to process your experience of life. It helps you to orient yourself in the world. And so for artists, we often feel like that, like as a writer, I have to write every day. As a painter, I have to paint every day in order for me to stay connected to the truth of who I am. If we don't have some kind of outlet like that, though, we tend to kind of just put ourselves into a different category that says, well, I'm not disciplined, or yeah, I've never really had a formal practice. And then we kind of skate around the issues. And of course, the issues are issues that are being generated by the ego, precisely to keep us away from the practice, right? To kind of keep practice as this sort of holy ground that we just can't fully embrace somehow in our lives. So the reason I wanted to talk about this now was obviously with the US elections this past week, we're really seeing what's going on from an evolutionary perspective, how the collective consciousness, the direction it's moving towards. So there were some big upsets that happened in the midterms, particularly like Georgia, Florida, Texas. But there was some really great hopeful things that happened with over 100 women getting elected to Congress. And so with that, we see an evolutionary intent, right? The collective consciousness is moving in a particular direction, moving away from the current sort of dominant cultural orientation that Trump has in the US towards this much more feminine, hopeful, embodied spirit, right, of togetherness and compassion and connection and inclusivity. So we see that there's this evolutionary intent that's moving away from separation and towards connection and unification, I guess is what I would say. So with that being really prominent in our collective field of awareness, one of the things that we can start to really tap into is, what am I doing? What is my part in this collective evolutionary intent of consciousness? How am I contributing to that? Or how am I actually kind of like holding back the reins on the expansion of consciousness collectively? How consciousness is becoming conscious of itself. Am I contributing to that? Or am I kind of holding that back? And when we look at our personal practices, we can see, like, if we're spending more time shut down, closed off, dominated by the ego, standing on the shore, then it's a little bit like, saying we're not racist, but then being complicit in all kinds of systems that require us to actually be involved in oppressing others, right? It's like you can't do both. So if you're not going to do the practice for yourself, maybe you're going to do it for the rest of the world. Maybe you're going to do it for the rest of collective consciousness, right? So when I think about how the process works, the process initially works on a very personal level for us. That's the easiest way for us to learn to integrate the process into our lives, to embody the process, is on a personal level by looking at our dreams and our desires. But our dreams and our desires are actually what I would refer to as like the practice ground for consciousness. The whole intention of a dream is to cause us, to move us in some way, to feel inspired, to become more than who we are right now, right? Like, we cannot embody, we cannot manifest the dream or desire that we have right now until we learn how to become the person that's capable of realizing that dream. So embedded in every dream or desire are our greatest spiritual gifts, because the dream or desire requires us to become conscious of our own consciousness and to evolve beyond our current limitations, right? So that's the function of the dream. The dream is always, it's twofold in that it acts as this inspiration, this like North Star guiding light that's pulling us, that's calling us, right? The dream is always something that's pulling us back into the ocean, pulling us to realize our true nature, because when we're on the shore, we're so deeply identified with the false self, we forget who we really are. And so that's the function of the dream, is to pull us back into the ocean and to be this inspirational guide. The second thing that the dream does for us, though, is that it presents all kinds of problems. It presents just a shitload of challenges and obstacles. And the reason for that is that is the ground of being that is required to transform who we are. It's not enough to just be inspired to change who we're being. We have to have some sort of, we have to have something to rub up against. We have to have some kind of friction, some kind of challenge that transforms us. So if we think about how, if I wanted to make pigment out of rock, I'd have to grind that rock down in order to turn it into a powder before I could bind it with any other type of agent to turn it then into a pigment, right? So I have to grind the rock down to do it. And in a way, our dream does the same thing to us. The obstacles, the challenges, the circumstances, situations, relationships that we're presented with as we pursue that dream, the function of those is to grind us down. It's to like sandpaper, to smooth off all those rough edges that have become these like kind of deeply ingrained and very firm boundaries that say, this is who I am, right? The ego has created this very fortified identity that says, this is who I am, this is who I will always be, and it holds very tightly to that. But in order for us to become someone new, we have to let go of that version of ourselves. So the way that we do that is through practice. So a good way to think about practice um, we don't often talk about this directly, but I'm going to speak to this very directly today, because I think maybe I failed to communicate this as clearly as it needs to be stated. So maybe some of you haven't recognized that the function of the pursuit of your dream is not just for the glorification or the pleasure, the entertainment of attaining your dream. There's really nothing self-serving about a dream at all through the lens of the process. The whole function of the dream is spiritual practice. So whatever the dream requires of you, the dream will always ask you to become someone you're not capable of being right now. It will ask you to sacrifice the thing you do not want to let go of. It will ask you to do the thing you do not want to do. And the reason for that is that that's what's required as a spiritual aspirant on the path, evolving one's consciousness from duality into non-dual awareness, or basically just saying consciousness becoming conscious of itself. If I want to become more of who I am, I have to learn to move beyond who I think I am in this moment. So every dream is spiritual practice. But of course, spiritual practice is not limited to, I sit down and I meditate for 15 minutes every morning, and I do a yoga class every day, and I do this chanting practice. It's not like that at all. Like, we have this really kind of funny approach to spiritual practice sometimes, because spiritual practices have largely been commercialized, right? They've been turned into ways to make money through capitalism. And so we have this narrow definition that it's like, I'm only practicing if I'm showing up and doing yoga on the mat like every day for 90 minutes, or I'm sitting and practicing with a group of people in my particular sangha, or I have some kind of formal structured practice. And I'm not in any way diminishing those things. Those things are all very essential. And that they often become obstacles in and of themselves. It's like, it's another thing to add to our list. I don't have time to get there. I can't afford to go there. I can't meditate because there's so many other things going on in my house. There's just like, the ego just comes up with any kind of excuse you can find to not do the practice, because we've defined that this is how the practice has to look. When in fact, the practice is embedded in every single aspect of your life. Like, there's never not a moment in your life when practice is not happening, but it requires your willingness and also your capacity to orient yourself through that lens at all times, which is essentially what it means to live in the ocean, right? If we're going to live in this world through the lens of the soul, we're orienting ourselves in the world through the lens of practice 24/7, no matter what the circumstances are. So if we think about, for some of us, we'll have certain areas of our life that seem to just kind of like go along without a hitch. For some of us, our health is just effortlessly and easy. We never have to worry about it. We just kind of take it for granted. It's always good. But like, the relationship with our child is hugely challenging, and it's constantly confronting us in some way. And it's a place where we get really tangled up in knots, and we get really frustrated. Or it might be financially that we're feeling that way, and we feel like it's an area of our lives that we can just not master. Or it might be a relationship with our partner or a family member where we're just angry and resentful all the time. So in each of those circumstances, the place where we're really getting triggered, that's where our practice is happening. It doesn't mean that practice isn't happening in the other areas of our lives, but specifically, the circumstances, people, situations, and experiences that really trigger us, that really cause us to kind of like move away from center. The experiences that we find ourselves unable to create that distance to be the observer of our experience, and we feel totally entangled and enmeshed in it, and we're just reacting to whatever is happening. That's practice right there. That's the place where we're trying to stay in the ocean, but inevitably it's the place where we end up on the shore, and we end up like then defending why we're on the shore. Like, we have every right to be on the shore, because can't you see how justified I am in shutting down and abandoning my practice in this moment. Because ultimately our practice is, it's not to make $1 million, it's not to quit our job, it's not to write a book, it's to know our true self. We can't do that on the shore, we can only do that in the ocean. So ultimately, everything that we're doing about a dream is to really commit to this practice of knowing ourselves. So practice has to happen all the time. So one of the ways that we can look at this is from the perspective of how practice is continuously refueling us. We all know that when we spend time, whether that be listening to the teachings, taking the time to engage in a meaningful conversation with like-minded peers and practitioners, meditating, doing yoga, painting, writing, whatever the practices are that you're doing, with the intent that this is your spiritual practice. You're not doing it to produce something. You're doing it to stay open to the truth of who you are. You're doing it to stay in the ocean. And if you have an attachment to something like, oh, well, writing is my practice and that's the only thing that you're doing, then make sure that you're mixing up your practice with other practices that really challenge you. Because if practice is easy all the time, you're not growing, right? There has to be some kind of rub there for growth to be happening. So we know, though, when we're doing our practices that after the fact, we always feel better. And the reason we feel better is because we've come in contact with the truth of who we are. Practice puts us in touch with the still, small, silent voice of the soul. And the reality is that we live in very busy times. We live in a very hectic, loud, noisy world. Things are constantly trying to get our attention. And in order for us to hear the voice of the soul that's whispering to us from the ocean, come here, come here. We can't hear that unless we make time for stillness and silence. And for most of us, making time for stillness and silence is the last thing that we're doing. Or even when we're making time for stillness and silence, and we're turning into some other, there's some ulterior motive or some agenda that the ego has around what we're doing. It's somehow bolstering our current identity. It's not actually about being quiet and connecting to the truth of who we are in that moment. When we are able to do that, though, we always feel better for having done it. And the reason for that is that it's a little bit like every time we practice with sincere commitment to know ourselves through whatever the means are that we're using as practice, it's a little bit like filling our gas tank. So more often than not, what ends up happening is when we're feeling really good in life, when we're feeling like, yeah, everything's going really well, that's when we abandon our practices. That's when we no longer think we need the support of a teacher or a like-minded community of practitioners. That's the time when we think, yeah, I'm going to try to go it on my own for a while. The ego sets us up for that. This is like the person who does a cleanse. They eliminate all the terrible things from their diet, and they start reintroducing foods, and they get to know their body really well, and they're feeling really good. And because they're feeling really good, they're taking more risks. And before you know it, it's like, oh yeah, well, I'm feeling so good. It's been great. And so now it's okay to have a glass of wine. And then that glass of wine leads to coffee with cream and sugar the next day. And then a week from now, it's like going out for dinner and having a glass of wine again, and then having like the bread that you haven't been eating or whatever. And before you know it, it's like you start to backslide. So practice is very much the same way. If we think about practice a little bit like your car, and practice is like putting gas in the tank. So every day when you do your practice, you're filling up your tank. And you'll notice that, like, if you go to a mechanic, they always tell you, like, don't let your car run all the way dry, because if you let the gas tank totally go empty, whatever the sediment is from all the gas you've been putting in at the bottom, then that's the stuff that's going to start running through the hoses, and before you know it, they're going to get blocked up, and then that's going to lead to problems down the road. So they always tell you, like, never let it go below a quarter of a tank. Ideally, what we're doing with practice is we're riding on a full tank all the time. So if my spiritual practice, where I'm really developing my consciousness, is maybe in my finances, and I have a whole bunch of bills coming due, then on a particular day, I'm going to spend a lot of energy. Hence, I'm going to deplete that gas tank because I really have to stay on top of things. I really have to commit to remaining open when all my stuff is getting triggered. I really have to commit to choosing to be happy no matter what. I really have to commit to staying clear about the truth of who I am and not getting pulled back onto the shore. So that's taking a lot of gas, right? Now, I might feel really exhausted, and the next day I'm like, oh, I'm just too tired to practice, so I don't practice. And then maybe the next day, because I didn't practice the day before, now I don't practice again. So now I'm really getting depleted. So maybe I go off and I spend like an hour and a half doing some practice, and then I feel really good again. And, you know, maybe a check comes in the mail, and so now I feel like, oh yeah, everything is fine. So the next day I don't practice. And another check comes and I don't practice again. So you start to see how where I'm really being challenged to grow and expand, to break down those barriers mentally about who I think I really am. In my day-to-day life, there's going to be a correlation. When things are going really well, chances are I'm not doing my practice because I think I don't need my practice when things are going really well. But inevitably, if I stop filling the gas tank on my car, I'm going to eventually run out of gas, which means that, well, maybe I'm not using a lot of gas today. Maybe I'm not using a lot of gas tomorrow. Maybe I'm not even using a lot of gas for the next week. But eventually, there's going to come a day when, oh, here's a big bill. So all that money that just came in last week that I went and spent, now I need it. And I don't have the money for this big bill. And so I'm going through gas like crazy, but I don't actually have the reserves because I didn't do my practice. In the same way, practice on a consistent basis. Like the reason that we have weekly teachings is so that there's something for us to do every week, something to focus on, right? This is part of our practice. Every week, engage with the teachings, spend time reflecting on the teachings, spend time contemplating, how does this relate in my life? Who am I actually being, right? That's the question that we're always asking. Who am I being in this circumstance or situation? What is the truth of who I am in this moment? Using the community to engage with others in that conversation. All of those things are filling your gas tank on a consistent basis. In addition to that, though, we need to have times when we go deeper, where we do a little bit like having a hot oil treatment on your hair. It's like you want to condition the roots. You want to start to sort of fortify what you're actually putting into the tank. So we can liken that to having an oil change. If I go and have an oil change regularly, it means that I tend to know in advance if there's going to be other problems. Like when the guy's putting oil in my car, he's going to say, hey, did you know that this tube has got a crack in it? You know, do you want this line changed? Because if it blows out when you're on the highway, you're going to break down and then you're going to be stranded, or you're not going to, you know, you're going to have to call someone to tow you away. Or he's going to say, hey, did you know that your tires are really bare? You should get those changed before winter so that you don't have a car wreck, you know? Or, hey, did you know that all your fluids are empty and there's a big snowstorm coming, you don't have any windshield wiper fluid? So an oil change is like that little regular check-in that we have that helps us to just kind of do a deeper assessment of what's really going on with all the interconnected systems, or in this case, the interconnected pieces of our lives. So even though we're going in for the oil change, we might find that there's some underlying condition that we didn't even know was a problem. And we become aware of it because we went in for the oil change. When things are going really well in our life, though, we tend to not do all that kind of maintenance stuff. So we let them fall by the wayside. Well, if I don't do my oil changes regularly, eventually my engine's going to seize. My engine seizes, I might need a new car. At the very least, I need a new engine. And that's going to cost a whole lot more money than it would for me to just get regular oil changes, which are like 40 bucks a pop, right? So in the same way, practice is like that. We need both consistent daily engagement where we can get quiet enough to hear the voice of the soul, so that when we're interacting in the rest of our lives and we're being challenged by what our dream is presenting us, maybe it's the financial challenge, maybe it's the relationship challenge, maybe it's the health challenge, whatever it is that's presenting itself to us, so that we can become conscious of who we are and evolve beyond the false self that practice that I did, that practice sitting quietly and making space of stillness and silence to hear what the soul was saying, now I'm not going to be as likely to get tangled up in whatever the experience is or the practice ground that my dream is presenting to me. In addition to that, when I do deeper amounts of work, so maybe on a daily basis, I'm just doing a short meditation every day, but maybe once a week, I'm spending time with the training and I'm actually doing some journaling and reflecting. Or maybe I'm painting or drawing every day, and then once or twice a week, I'm actually doing a deeper meditation or a yoga practice. Or maybe I'm going on retreat, or maybe I'm doing more intensive one-on-one work with somebody. All of these things are like getting the oil change. We're conditioning ourselves. We're not doing these things because we're in crisis trying to get out, which is the capitalist model, what the ego sells us. Create a problem and then sell us the solution so we can get out of crisis, right? That's not the same. From the soul's perspective, when everything is going well, that's when we keep doing practice. Because if we stop doing practice when everything is going well, what ends up happening is there's a whole series of unintended consequences that we could never anticipate. Because right now everything looks okay. But eventually the gas tank's going to run out. Eventually the engine's going to seize. Eventually there's going to be all kinds of problems that are much bigger than the ones that we had if we had just continued consistently with our practice. So when you think about working with the process, notice whether or not you view the process as merely a roadmap for you to manifest your dreams. Even though we talk a lot about consciousness, subconsciously you might just be looking at it as, well, I don't really need to do this regularly. This is optional. I don't really need to focus on this. I can still realize my dream. I'm just doing this along with a whole bunch of other stuff and kind of taking a crapshoot and hoping that my dream is going to be realized. The whole function of the process as a framework is for us to become conscious of our own consciousness. It is a spiritual practice, right? This is a contemplative practice. We call it practice for a reason because practice is essential. So if you're called to action this week, I want you to be really honest with yourself and first do an inventory. Like, are you actually practicing? And if you are, what do you consider to be practice? And let us know what that is. So for some of you, you might consider practice just listening to the weekly teaching and spending some time reflecting on it and maybe commenting in the group. For some of you, you might have a daily practice of meditation or yoga. For some of you might have a daily practice of writing, painting, drawing, whatever it is that you're doing. For some of you, you might have other practices that you're doing, chanting, whatever it is. Let us know what your practice is, what you consider to be practice. And then secondly, where is the ground of practice arising in your life? So it might be your marriage, could be your finances, could be your health. It could be a combination of things where your business and an ailing parent, there's somehow a combination of things that are going on there. Maybe you can't focus on your business because you're taking care of an ailing parent, right? So figure out what is the ground of practice, and then look at how much time and energy are you spending getting really entangled in that ground of practice. Whatever the circumstance, issue, relationship, or situation is that your dream is presenting as the opportunity for you to practice your own conscious evolution. How much time are you spending on that compared to how much time you're actually spending refilling the tank, conditioning the tank by going deeper, doing more intensive periods of work at sort of incremental times? So we're very comfortable going deeper when things have fallen apart. So for example, we get divorced and suddenly now we're on a spiritual path. We're going on retreat, we're doing a yoga teacher training, we're doing all kinds of things because our job ended, our husband left, our parents died, whatever it is, right? But we fail to do those things when things are going well. When things are going well, the ego convinces us that everything is fine, just go back to being who you were being before you know it, we've been lulled into the false self once again, right? So look at how much time you're spending on practice and how much time you're spending entangled in whatever the ground of practice is that your dream has presented for your own growth and evolution. And then let us know, what is it that needs to happen now? Are you doing enough practice to actually be able to be the witness in this ground of being that you're experiencing as your field of practice? So for example, I would say my primary field of practice right now is my relationship with John. I'm very conscious of what's happening when it's happening. And there is very much a direct proportional relationship. When I let my practice suffer, I'm not able to respond in the way that I would if my gas tank was full, right? So John could say or do something, and immediately I shut down, I create separation, I'm standing on the shore, I'm defending, I'm feeling justified. I might be witness to all of this. I might recognize that that's exactly what I'm doing as I'm doing it, but I'm still so entangled in it, I can't not do it, right? The practice that we do on a day-to-day basis and the deeper intensives that we do for conditioning to kind of like keep everything running optimally, all of that is what determines our capacity to not only just be the witness to what the experience is that's arising in the ground of practice that our dream presents, but it determines our capacity to not be so entangled in it that we don't have control over what our response is, and instead we habitually react to the circumstance. So until we have enough in our tank consistently, we have built the capacity, as we say, right? We're not going to be able to transform that ground of being in our lives that the dream is presented. That's the whole function of the dream, is for us to be able to be in that specific sphere of our lives and to be able to respond, to be able to stay open, to be able to witness what's happening without getting entangled, pulled into it and shutting down or closing off, right? To keep energy flowing freely from that state of openness rather than moving into separation, which requires us to close off. So when we're consistently practicing, part of what we're doing there is we're conditioning our capacity to stay open at all times to the truth of who we are. The truth of who we are is the person we are when we're in the ocean. Everyone who's in the ocean with us helps us to stay open, helps us to maintain that capacity, right? So if you imagine that, if you're out in the water and you're swimming and somebody's drowning, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to pull onto you and they're going to try to pull you under as a way for them to get to the surface. They're not intentionally trying to pull you under. They're just trying to get to the surface to breathe, right? So if we're not surrounded by people who can carry their own in the ocean, right, stay afloat on their own, then we're surrounded by people who are pulling us under. Not because they're bad or broken or wrong or whatever. It's just they're not practicing, right? They don't have the same awareness. They're oriented through the lens of the ego that is completely saturated their awareness in illusion, right? And I'm not in any way saying that I am free of this, right? We're all doing this process together. All of humanity is trying to evolve from that illusion of the false self, personally and collectively, into this state of non-dual awareness where separation no longer exists. So it's essential that we practice. It's essential that we have community. It's essential that we give ourselves time to go deep on a regular basis. It's essential that we maintain our practices, especially when things are going well. So your call to action, what's your practice look like right now? What's your daily practice? Be honest with yourself. Where is that ground of practice arising in your day-to-day life? So when I refer to what your practice look like, the practice is what you're doing to hear that still small voice, right? The voice of the soul. We have to be quiet. We have to be still. So there has to be something going on a regular basis. Daily is optimal for you to connect with that. And there has to be periods of time where you're going deeper. So, whether that's spending an hour or half an hour or 20 minutes every single day doing something, and then once a week doing something deeper, or it's maybe your practice is quite substantial every day and you're going deeper once a week or once a month or once every 3 months, and you're going deeper by some sort of intensive 2-3 days, 4 days a week, whatever it is, right? And then your ground of practice is, what is your dream presenting in your life, the place where you're being challenged to grow? So that's going to be the obstacle, the issue that you're facing, the thing that you continuously get pulled into. And if you're not finding anything in your life that's pulling you into something, then you're not pursuing a dream that's causing you to grow at this point, right? So in all likelihood, what's happened is you failed to keep pace with your dreams or desires. You're kind of just in a holding pattern right now, which is totally fine. Like, it takes a while for us to manifest a dream and then be open for the next dream. But even when we're still like failing to keep pace with our dreams and desires, there's something that's coming up. It's almost like we have sort of a niggling sensation that it's like the other shoe is going to drop or something, because we haven't. It's like when everything's going well and we stop practicing, we know eventually there's going to be unintended consequences that we're going to have to deal with, because the larger part of us knows that that practice is essential. So look forward to hearing from everybody what you're learning, how you're experiencing it, and let us know how those two things are showing up in your life so that we can support you. Okay, have a great week.